I had a free speech question. So when you do something like draw Muhammad, is there, how much should I be concerned about the real possibility that there's a threat to my life, and how much should I say free speech is too important that I shouldn't care about that, or what's the balance between when should I actually not draw Muhammad because there's that real threat there?
So that's a great question. I wouldn't consider that necessarily a free speech question as much as a sort of a question of ethics and your own decisions about what kind of risks you want to take. It's a hard question to answer. I mean, I don't have an easy answer for you. I can say that. This doesn't help much, but if things had gone differently and everybody had published the Muhammad cartoons back in, really you can trace this whole debate and issue back to the Salman Rushdie affair in 1989, and the Western world has behaved badly ever since then by not standing up for freedom of speech, and now we're in a position where we as individuals have to make choices of the type that you just articulated. I don't have really good advice for you. And I don't really even want to try to give you advice about this because, it's a really personal thing. I think there is some risk, although I would say in general, as a private party and as a private person sort of out in the world, the risk is lower. But you have to consider things like, I don't know how many people heard about the cartoonist Molly Norris. Now, she was a public figure, but she came up with the idea after the cartoon controversy in Europe of Draw Muhammad Day, and the idea was we all draw Muhammad, and they can't come after all of us, and of course nobody did, and they came after her, and now she's in hiding. So that's scary, right? We thought about it, and we think about it all the time. I thought about it in writing the book that I wrote, although we didn't publish the cartoons for other reasons, really more practical reasons. But we do publish them on the website. But we're an organization, and we think very seriously about security. As an individual, it's different. But I don't. What I would say is it's the best thing you can do to combat the attacks on free speech is to speak up. So I would speak up about the issue. As to whether to draw cartoons or how widely to publicize them, that's a tougher call, and I can't think of any good advice to give you other than if the more broadly you disseminate it and the more you turn yourself into a figure on the issue, the more attention you're likely to draw to yourself. But don't think of it as you have an obligation to put your life in danger for the sake of free speech. That's definitely wrong. But you ought to take whatever opportunities you can to speak up, in a safe way, and push back against those who are attacking free speech. I don't know if other people have other thoughts on it, but
I would just say, you certainly don't have an obligation, but right, this is a fundamental right that if we lose the battle, we lose the war, we lose everything. If nobody draws cartoons, then we've lost. It's important. So I'd never say you phrased it like, should I care that my life is threatened? Well, of course you should care. And that it has to be a consideration. But if we all take the position of we care so much that our life is threatened that we say nothing, then we've lost. So you have to think about to what extent is a right of free speech essential to all your other rights, all your other freedoms, and to what extent are you willing to go out on a limb in order to defend it? And I think it's crucial that we go out on some limb. How far you go, you each are going to have to make your own evaluation on how far you want to go. But it's at the end of the day, fighting for freedom is not optional to a moral human being. We have to fight for freedom. How you fight, how you construct that fight is up to you. Let's go this side.
Yeah, okay. So I had a question about Onkar's talk on the nature of free will. So I really like the objectivist identification of focus as like the crucial thing to talk about. But it seems like focus can be affected by antecedent factors. And I can think of at least two big categories. So like caffeine or even harder drugs, which can help you focus, and also practice. Like if you have experience reading for long periods of time, it helps you read for long periods of times in the future. And I'm wondering how to integrate that with my acceptance of objectivists' focus on focus. Are there different aspects of this same thing that's focus? Is it different definitions, things that we're referring to as focus? So what are your thoughts on caffeine and practice?
I don't think those kinds of things affect the choice. They affect what happens when you choose focus. So take an even simpler kind of thing. When you're tired, I think you can still raise your level of awareness, but you can't raise it to, no, if you're an medical intern and you've done a 48-hour shift and now you're trying to think, it's really hard. But I think you can still make that choice. But the level of focus and what you're able to do when in focus is very different. And normally what would you do in that kind of case is figure, look, I shouldn't make any decisions now. I shouldn't treat this patient because I don't have, even if I'm choosing focus, I'm not going to be able to think clearly about this. And so you take caffeine because it helps. That when you choose to think, you can think better. And particularly if you're super tired and you're taking caffeine. Though I think one can be deceived about how much of an effect it has. The issue of experience, that's part, I'm not sure what you mean exactly, but if you meant, that's part of what I was putting in terms of a virtuous circle. That when you choose focus, what you're choosing is to use your available abilities, resources, and the more experience you have, and the more knowledge you have, and the more skills, including thinking skills you've developed, when you choose to think, that will be more, the thinking will be more efficacious. But that's not a difference in the choice. It's a difference as the result when you think, yeah, I mean, I think now when I go into focus, there's all kinds of issues that I could solve that I couldn't solve when I was 10 years old. But that's not a difference of the choice. It's a difference of the result of it.
Just to concretize my point on practice, sometimes when you are talking to people about reading Atlas Shrugged, it's such a long book, and some people, it's not really a big deal to make it through it because they've read long books before. Some people, they've never read a book that's longer than 200 pages, and it seems like an enormous thing. So practicing sustained periods of focus, it seems like it's a long-term achievement to train yourself to stay in focus.
Yeah, I don't, in that kind of example, I don't think that you're using focus as just concentration on a particular task. That focus at the primary choice it's different than that. It is just an issue of alertness, not yet concentration on some particular thing. And yes, I think one can develop one's ability to concentrate. I mean, there's some studies that all the phones and all the interruptions affect someone's ability, even when they want to concentrate, to be able to concentrate. But that's different than the basic set of alertness and of control. It's a much narrower and later thing to be trying to do some particular task, including reading a long novel.
Right. Thank you.
Sam Harris addresses the view of compatibilism in his book Free Will, and argues that adopting a perspective allowing for deterministic laws and free will is sort of a bait and switch, that it changes the subject. He points out how the most conventional view of free will is of a supernatural nature. In my view, the most crucial question of the issue is exactly what we regard our human will to be free from. And I was wondering, what in Rand's view is human will free from? Exactly.
So I don't think it's exactly the right way to think of it. What is it free from? It's free. It's that it's chosen. So what it is you're selecting among alternatives. So I agree with Harris that the compatibilism, and this is not unique to Harris. There's a lot of criticisms. So compatibilism is the view that you can have determinism and free will. The two are compatible. They're not opposing ideas. And his view, but as I say, it's not unique to Harris. A lot of people think this, that they're just redefining what freedom and free will means. And that's the bait and switch. And I think that is true, that is what free will means is you're selecting among alternatives. And it means you're selecting. So it's not other things doing it. And in that sense, you can say you're free from, it's not, as Yaron's bringing, it's not your genes, it's not your environment, it's not what your mother told you when you were 2. It's you deciding now. That's the cause, not these other things. That's the view, but the primary is that's the cause, it's not these other things. That's the secondary thing. The primary is you're doing it. It's your action, your choice. And that's what Harris thinks you don't do. That's the sense that he thinks in a fundamental way you're not in control.
Hi. It seems that the choice to think or accept or reject ideas is a skill that can often go unpracticed or untaught. So to what extent is someone responsible for their lack of intellectual independence if they are less exposed to that kind of skill? And it's kind of a two-pronged question. Is there a point at which someone has been so intellectually disarmed and their thought systems are so tangled that their ability to detangle or get clarity is so compromised that they're somehow less responsible for bad ideas?
It is the choice to think or focus is the choice to use what you have available to you and what you have developed. So yes, I definitely think there is such a thing as the person's trying to think about it and can't make heads or tails of it, and that's not intellectual dependence if that's what he's doing. But there's a lot of choices involved in that. It doesn't mean then, oh, so what other people say must be true. It's like, I can't figure out heads or tails what's going on. I wonder if those people actually know anything. So take, for instance, the issue of religion. There's many questions you can ask yourself about, including the simplest thing that the child asks, like, if God's all-powerful, can he make a stone that he can't lift? And the child can get, like, I'm not getting a very good answer to this question. And I might not know, and I might not yet be able to figure out, no, that you can have a view that there is no God, and so. But the status of the ideas will have difference, and if he really takes seriously, I'm thinking about it, I can't figure this out, it doesn't sound like they can figure it out, so I'm not just following what they're doing. So there's, even at a more primitive level, there's elements of that you can exert that kind of independence, but you have to think, a lot of the thinking, when you're both judging yourself and you're judging others, is it that I could have figured this out and I wasn't really trying, or it's no, I was trying and they're trying, and when this becomes even more complicated because it's an issue of the thinking skills and the knowledge that they have or is available to them. So, and when you project back in history and things, or you just project, it's hard to figure out if you project a young child, teenager, raised in some of these Mormon communities, totally isolated. They try to seal off every outside viewpoint. So what can they figure out if they're thinking about it? I think there are some things, but it's not a lot that they can. So that kind of both of yourself and other people, you have to factor those kinds of things in. And it's very dependent on the particular circumstances, the particular person, their knowledge, their abilities, and so. But it matters when you can't figure out something. What do you do as well? And that's important to think about.
Yeah, and to your second part of the question, I certainly think that you can screw somebody up so badly that they can't get out of it. Certainly, both psychologically and just cognitively, the tool has been damaged so badly that they just have no way to go. So in that sense, they're now, and I feel sorry for people like that, right? But that's not what we mean when we talk about human beings and the full potential of a human being. That's a sad state of affairs. But yeah, you can brainwash people. You can do horrible things to people's cognitive ability. Isolate them in a way that they only know a particular, and they can't think beyond that. So yes, but I think that's the exception. I don't think that's the rule.
All right. This question is specifically for Onkar, but anyone else, feel free to jump in. So I'm wondering, say that we had a computer simulation that we ran where we could clone our universe right at this instant down to the smallest unit of matter. And then we ran that simulation and looked inside and saw that the outcome of that digital feature was identical to our physical feature. Would that integrate with the objectivist view on free will, or do you have reason to believe that the outcome of the digital simulation would be different?
I'm not sure I followed exactly what the scenario was. So is the scenario that if someone could predict?
The scenario would be that we could make a digital clone of our universe.
Okay.
Basically identical, like a computer simulation, but there was living people in it.
I don't know.
I mean, I find the whole thing bizarre, right? The idea is that you can boil everything in the universe to 0 and 1s. I mean, only a computer scientist would think such a thing, right? I mean, the whole field, it's like economists who believe that you can explain everything through economics, and computer scientists think that you can explain everything with 0s and 1s. But life is not 0 or 1. Biology is not digital, right? Biology is different. This whole idea that we can boil down human consciousness or boil down even the biological activities of our bodies just to 0 1s and simulate it is just false. It's just, you can't build that simulation. It's a thought experiment with no reality. But at the end of the day, I would argue no, even if somehow you could do it. But of course you can't. Because you can't simulate, one of the things you can't simulate is free will. Right? And free will is not 0 or 1. It's not determined by whether the electron goes on or doesn't go on. I mean, that's just not what free will is. So you can't simulate it digitally. I don't think you can simulate life digitally.
But if you did simulate it digitally, the people inside of your hypothetical universe would behave just like we would and would make their own choices and things would come out differently. But I mean, you can spin out these kinds of hypotheticals endlessly, and they're just that. They're just telling stories. They're not actually telling us anything about the real world, right? So if you could make a robot that was identical to a human being in every single way, including the functionings of its consciousness, it would have free will by definition, because it would be identical to a human being in every single way. That doesn't tell us anything to sort of hypothesize in that way.
I have a question about the idea that at the Donald Trump, or where you spoke to the Donald Trump supporters,
yeah,
and they booed you off the stage,
well,
and then you said,
I didn't leave.
Right. And then they said that, or you said that it was because they were in fear of culture and immigration coming to here and taking over. And so my question is if there is one, what is the relation between that and the culture of political correctness and forcing us to not speak out against any culture at all and accepting every culture as it is?
I mean, it's a backlash. So I think what you have today in the whole Donald Trump phenomena and the so-called alt-right and this whole thing is a backlash against the left, against the complete disintegration that if you say anything about Western civilization, you're racist, which was the previous week. That's what I was called, right? Because I defended Western civilization, I'm a racist. There's only certain things you can say and you can't say other things. And clearly they see all that as wrong, but they don't know why it's wrong and they don't know what the right answer is. So they gravitate to the opposite kind of emotionally, non-intellectually, and it's a backlash. It's an emotional, perceptual level, non-really cognitive. This is why fear plays such a big role in it. And I just saw, I was flipping through Facebook and I saw this little ad that just came out. Donald Trump, his son is on this thing. And the whole ad is about illegal immigrants, and they like to say illegal because illegal causes you to think about what? What's illegal? Crime. So illegal immigrants commit crimes, commit horrific crimes. All they do almost is commit crimes. Therefore, to protect ourselves, we have to stop illegal immigration. No data, no statistics. I mean, nothing about whether illegals do commit crimes or not. I haven't seen any data on this. And the data that I have seen doesn't suggest that it's happening at all. But it doesn't matter, right? It's just to elicit fear, right? And it's And it's partially a backlash against the fact that you cannot, the left doesn't allow you to even talk about, any kind of issues related to culture or civilization or good values and bad values, to make any kind of evaluation of good or bad. So, yeah, I think the whole phenomena wouldn't exist in the form it exists. Something else would exist, if not for the left, right? So this is a backlash against the left.
Can I add a couple of things? Did you
No,
go
go
ahead? As you were saying, illegals commit crimes. I mean that as the formulation, and that there's no statistics backing it up. I mean, one could just as easily say in response, Americans commit crimes, right? Because that's actually true. So maybe all Americans need to be deported. I mean, they're inherent in this whole formulation is really two things, and I think Yaron talked about both of them both last night and maybe it was today, but it's collectivism. It's that everybody, you can just look at these large groups of people, and if we have a few representative samples of them, they all behave the same way, and then it's a lack of free will. They all are just, one is just like the other, is just like the other, is just like the other, so we can group them all together and say that they all behave. But it's nonsense. They're individual human beings. I mean, even if it's true that the incidence of crime among illegals was, even if it was 90%, like 90 out of 100 illegals commit crimes. Okay, so those 90 people are criminals, and let's go after them and put them in prison. The other 10 are not, and what the hell is your problem with them? Like, they're not doing anything wrong. So there's no issue there. Now, as to the earlier point about the parallels between the left and the right on this, I was actually at the talk that Yaron gave at the when he criticized the Trump people, and I mean, wholeheartedly agree. And what struck me was interesting. I was looking around the room, and my first thought, of course, was this is just like what the right complains that the left does on campuses. And then to his credit, one of his fellow people on the panel actually said that to the crowd. He said, "You all remind me of a bunch of leftist, campus activists who are shouting people down. Be quiet and let the man speak." And they quieted down for a little while, and then of course it all came back. I mean, it was like a minute and a half. But one of the things, and so Yaron's point that there's an element of this has to do with fear, I think is absolutely right. I mean, there's much more going on here as well. But I think you see this on both sides. Among the conservatives who are, at least the Trump supporters, who are shouting down their adversaries, and then a lot of the same things are going on America's campuses. Implicitly, there is a very much an emotionalistic view that that either I am controlled by my emotions, or I'll just allow myself to be controlled by my emotions. But in either event, there's not a whole lot of thinking going on. Let me just leave it at that.
I want to say one.
Sure.
'Cause you put it in terms of partial backlash, and I think that's important, because I think the backlash part of it is pretty small. It's real, but what you see, I don't have the view that the right is great. And that the left is, so it's all, they're responding to everything bad in the left, and they've gone a little too far. I don't think that is what is happening. So but it gives them an excuse. I think on both sides what you see, and this is one of the things I find particularly disturbing in the election, that you have two, in different ways, I think, power-hungry candidates. And this was a point Ayn Rand made about the rise of dictatorships. They rely on scapegoating. And both sides, so Yaron was talking about the inequality. Hillary Clinton, when you watch her and the people behind, like Elizabeth Warren, it's such scapegoating of rich people. It's the 1%. They're responsible for all our problems. Give me power, I'll take care of them, and everything will be great. And you see a similar phenomenon with different scapegoats on the right. And it's not explained by what the other side are doing. This is a play for power. And it's a very dangerous.
And the scapegoating on the right, I think, is worse than the scapegoating on the left.
Because they do it to the 1%.
Well, they do it to the 1% as well. But it's also kind of the 1% are part of us, and we know them, and there's a certain, but on the right, it's a scapegoating of the other, focused, concentrated. I mean, it's not an accident that trade and immigration are Trump's big things. And not only was I booed on on immigration, but I was really booed on trade. I mean, they really got pissed off when I said Donald Trump's completely wrong on trade, and everybody knows, since Adam Smith, we've known this, right? This is not new. They freaked out about that, right? Why? Because trade is a way of scapegoating the other. We Americans, we're great. We've never done anything wrong. We make all the right choices. If only those Chinese didn't screw us. we'd be fantastic. And if only those, and Donald Trump doesn't only focus on Chinese. He often mentions the Koreans and the Japanese and anybody who's another, who looks differently than us, right? And then he never talks about trade with Europe, right? Because they're not other enough, right? And it's about immigrants, right? And it's always a certain type of immigrant that he's focused on, right? Again, it's the other. So it's very much this, racial, ethnic, even though it's not explicit. This is what fascists have always done. Now, again, Donald Trump himself might not be a fascist, but this is the technique that leads to fascism, that leads to authoritarianism, is you blame all our problems on that other group. If we take care of that other group, everything will be fine. And you're seeing it on left and right. And it's all about power, and it's all about control, and it's all about authoritarianism, and it should really, really, really scare you guys.
Right. But if you want another example right now of the same dynamic of finding excuses by pointing outside and scapegoating as a means of getting power and dominating people, you don't have to look back too far in history. You can look at the present day, because if you dig into the narrative that the jihadists have, it's that the West is what has stopped the Muslim people of the world from their rightful place as dominant group, and that therefore the West has to be toppled. And that's a short version of what they spend a long time teaching people. And it's just, that is a means for them to justify what they do, to justify power. It's a really profound insight about the way that power-hungry people work. Now, the powerlessness we have in the United States look different and behave differently, but in essence, they're not fundamentally different from the power-hungry people in the Middle East who are doing real harm to the world. So I mentioned that as a widening of the context.
Hi.
Hi.
So, according to Onkar, so free will is something that that can, if you don't practice it, you sort of have cognitive drift, right? And so if you don't practice free will, you have cognitive drift, right? So like you have people who are drifting a lot, and so how wide, and the thing is, how widespread that is across populations is probably different. And you were referring to how free will plays a part in foreign policy and how you study people and what they do. But if a large sections of the population are drifting and they're simply adopting the ideas around them, which is what you often see in, which is what you see in a lot of these places, because you don't have people, because the transition to a Muslim, it's much easier in a Muslim country than it is somewhere else. So, so I think the traditional models can be pretty accurate, which they can approximate where the trends are going within these countries based upon sort of demographics and what people tend to do, because since these people are capable of drifting, and they'd be very prevalent that these people who drift, they're not quite using their free will in the appropriate way. And so I was wondering whether in order to actually effectively assume how much impact free will has upon change in ideas or demographics, whether you have to account for the fluidity and the limitations of free will.
So I think it is a fact that lots of people, do drift and they become passive recipients of ideas, and that shapes how they behave. I think, I don't question that. Does that, I'm not sure where the question is going though, so is that something that you regard as a limitation on the role of free will in their life?
No, because what I assumed is that if you were challenging sort of the traditional way that academics approach studying certain cultures and impact of certain ideas and what group of people are going where and and sort of how people develop intellectually, about why someone might become a jihadist, for example. So why someone might become a jihadist, like they see things like, for example, engineers tend to be turned to jihadists more often than most other professions. And then they look at those regions and they say, okay, well, the problem is that there's a lot of out-of-work engineers. Since there's a lot of out-of-work engineers there, then, I mean, but that's not implying that is the sole reason.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that can you really say that those predictions are entirely inaccurate, given that people are capable of drifting and people are capable of letting their free will go and simply flowing with the herd?
Well, I regard that as an instance of not choosing the right level of focus. So it's a consequence of badly using one's free will, in effect. So just to take apart the question, so the data that I've seen is that leaders of the jihadist movement tend to have come from medical and engineering backgrounds. And the people who often are the foot soldiers tend to come from less educated backgrounds. What does that tell us? Is it that there are a lot of unemployed and kind of bored people and they decide, well, why not? Let's go shoot some people up. I don't think that's how it works. But let me get to the issue of drift. But if you look in those cultures, you can be an engineer and a top flight engineer and yet be really mentally passive. And that passivity or drift and even evasion, that has implications for the kind of ideas you will go into and the things you'll accept and so forth. But that is a choice, it's a default, but it's still a choice. So here's what I think is significant. If you recall Onkar's talk, and he described this kind of virtuous circle of the more you think and you're in focus, the better at it you become. I'm sure I'm capturing it, but there's this virtuous circle of your success gives you that kind of boost. It works the other way around too. If you're passive, you're more susceptible to obeying authority and being told what to do and enslaving yourself to others, literally enslaving yourself to others. And that is what it means to be religiously observant in that culture, is that you follow authority. And the more you go down that path, what does that mean? Don't think, don't focus, don't ask questions, just do what you're told. And that is a big part of how the jihadist movement gains recruits, because there's a large population of people who have been told that to be good is to obey authority. And that creates a pool that you can recruit from, and people who want to be power, they want power and they want to be leaders and they know how to manipulate other people into obeying and being good. So there's definitely an issue of drift and passivity or lethargy that goes into people's being moved by irrational ideas and not questioning what they're doing. But I regard them as culpable for that. And I think there's different people in the movement that you can look at and what roles they play and what they're doing and different kinds of culpability. But I don't think that drift and passivity should just be taken out as, well, okay, well, what can you say about those people? So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but did you want to clarify?
I think what you're asking is kind of Marxist determinism exist if everybody's drifting, right? If they've rejected their own free will. And in a sense, yeah. I mean, once people give up on free will, once they're really drifting, then they're going to be determined by all kinds of forces around them. And yeah, when academics look and they say, oh, there's unemployment, and then but that's not the essential. The essential is they chose not to think. The essential is that there's certain ideas in the culture which intellectuals propagate explicitly and who are moving people in a particular direction. So it's two choices. It's a choice of the people to drift, and it's a choice of the intellectuals to propagate bad ideas that cause them to drift in a particular direction. And those people are culpable, and everybody's culpable, because you choose to drift, and you choose as an intellectual to have certain ideas and to propagate those ideas.
Yaron, you touched on it briefly when you said you don't think that immigrants are coming here for welfare, and yeah. I agree, and I agree with the heroism that you spoke about. But it reminded me of a talk I saw by Milton Friedman given back in the 80s, where he was talking about how before 1914, you had completely open borders. People came here, they produced, and we grew as a nation, and we look on that positively. Today, we say, oh, if we open the borders, people flood in, and we can't have that. And he lays the blame on the welfare system and looks at the incentives facing people in 1914 versus today. He has an interesting line where he said that immigration today only works because it is illegal, and because you come here, you don't necessarily have access to the welfare system.
Then we should celebrate illegals. So okay.
So, but my question isn't so much, I'm not justifying the current system.
Yeah.
My question is, if you look at the past where you had low barriers to entry, low guarantee of any sort of security from the state, now you have high barriers to entry, and for citizens at least, high guarantee of security from the state. Can we completely open up our borders and have totally free immigration without eliminating or deconstructing the welfare system first?
But these are all false kind of dichotomies. Look, nobody's saying lower the borders, and just like I'm not saying let's do away with Social Security tomorrow, right? Social Security is immoral. We all agree Social Security is immoral, so let's do away with it tomorrow, right? We're talking about where we want to move towards versus where we are today, right? We want to move towards free immigration. We want to move towards open borders, just like we want to move towards there being no Social Security. How we get there, the exact steps that are reasonable given the welfare state, given everything else, we can talk about, right? That would be an interesting debate to have, but that's not the debate I see out there, right? The debate, even among objectivists who object to kind of open borders, is not how do we get to open borders, the particular steps, but it's the goal they object to. So that's one, but I disagree with the motivation for erecting barriers was the welfare state. I mean, historically, I don't think that's true. I think the reason we have a welfare state is the same reason we don't like immigrants. It's the same collectivism, statism that drove America to establish a welfare state since 1914, has closed off our borders. So if you look at the first anti-immigration bill that ever passed in the United States, it wasn't because Chinese were coming here to get welfare. It's because we resented Chinese people because they were different. So there was a certain racist element to it. And there was the zero-sum perspective that they were taking jobs. And so the first bill that limited immigration in the 19th century was a bill limited to Chinese immigration and restricted Chinese immigrants because they had come and helped build the railroad, and somehow we resented that, right? And then if you look at 1914, there was barely, post-World War I, there was barely any welfare, and yet we restricted immigration almost completely to the point where people trying to escape Europe from the ravages of World War II couldn't get into the United States. I mean, there's the famous stories of the Jews trying to escape Hitler, and we wouldn't let them in, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no correlation between these things. Both the consequences are more fundamental ideas about collectivism, statism, culture, philosophical, political ideas. Mm-hmm. Now, what could we do today? What couldn't we do today? I mean, you could, for example, say all immigrants don't get welfare if that was a huge concern, right? Or but the fact is that most immigrants that come to this country work, and for better or for worse, they pay taxes, they pay into the Social Security system, they pay into this. So if Americans use that money in a sense through welfare, so I mean, all these arguments, I just don't think they stand up to reality. I don't think the empirical evidence is there, but I don't see, there's no causal relationship. It's not driven by that.
And it's part of the scapegoating. When you think the issue through, why wouldn't we give immigrants welfare? Like, if you're against welfare, why are you so happy to give it to because someone's born in America, but they're born 10 miles south of the border, and you don't want to give it? They don't care about welfare. If that was really an objection, it was let's limit welfare, not let's limit immigration.
Well, and that's more my question is that...
Is the order in which you do it?
Maybe it's too practical, or maybe it's too much a policy question, but it's that today I agree that people who are coming here are productive and are making their way and are paying taxes and what have you, but if you change the incentive structure to where it's wide open, different people...
But it's not going to happen. Look, I mean, these are all hypotheticals. If the world was a world in which we could actually open the borders, then it would be a world in which we could eliminate welfare as well. So let's do both. Cool, right? And as I said, I resent giving welfare to an American more than I resent giving welfare to an immigrant.
All right, so this morning we started by determining that seeking knowledge, seeking truth, and the ability to focus is critical in understanding the world. These virtues are being suppressed on college campuses when taking the pro-Israel side. In fact, you're labeled a bigot, a racist, a human rights violator. It seems Israel's held to a very different standard. I was wondering, what is the root of this hatred, and what can college students do to have a proactive talk and not being labeled a bigot, racist, and is being anti-Israel, is that the new anti-Semitism, or how can you explain this hatred towards Israel on college campuses?
Okay, everyone's looking at me. I should speak on this. It's a complex phenomenon, but I think crucial to it is that it's not for Israel's alleged sins that it's hated. And when you look into its alleged sins, they don't really stack up. They don't even come close. So there are things wrong with Israel. It's a flawed country in certain ways, and there's a lot to criticize, but nothing, not even the worst of what it's been accused of, even if that were true, comes even close to what is true and well documented in Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, even more respectable countries like Jordan, which are horrific dictatorships. So it's not for anyone really concerned with human rights should be up in arms about those countries and protesting them in the streets every day. So to me, that exposes a double standard and a hypocrisy, which reveals what I think is really at the core of it, which is it's what makes Israel good that is the cause of their hatred, which is that it does, to a significant degree, allow for freedom. It does, and it has prospered materially. Economically, it's a dynamo compared to all the countries in the region. So to me, it's a real inversion morally to view it that way, as the people on campus do. On what one can do about it, I think it's a difficult challenge, but the core of it is to get out the reality of the situation, to disarm the critics and say, if you really care about human rights, you should be celebrating all the non-Jewish people, all the Arabs who live in Israel who have rights and who have a much better life than they do across the board in Jordan or any other country. That's what it would look like to care about human rights. And then to point out that what they should celebrate and what everyone in the region should emulate is the features of Israel that enable it to protect freedom. Now, part of what makes it challenging is that it's put in terms, so as Yaron experienced, so if you read about Yaron's experience in Exeter, and it's not unique, in fact, this is the norm here in the North America, is that anything that you say critical of Muslims or Palestinians in particular is translated as racism. And part of that comes from this idea that what makes people is their inborn background and the equation of Muslim with ethnicity. And Palestinian is a kind of blending of religion and political goals and race. So it's a very perverse kind of concept. And so the result is that you're blamed or criticized for being a racist, which is false. It is not racist to criticize Hamas, which is an Islamist group. It is not racist to criticize all the other Palestinian factions or any other group in the region that seeks to dominate people and tyrannize them, which is the norm. So I think it's essential it's a lot of work, basically, but you want to get people to see what the actual facts are, what the value framework really is, what it means to stand up for individual rights, and where one would stand as a result of having that framework, which is you would have to stand with Israel and against its enemies. And the charge of racism it's a cheap and discreditable smear, because it's quite obvious that it's not racism. Now, there are racist people, and some of them are pro-Israel, and that's a bad thing, and there are racists in Israel who hate the Arabs. But that's not the core of the issue. I don't think you can explain it that way. And it's essential to get people to see that you should and have to criticize the ideas that people hold and act on. And I think the Palestinian movement is essentially an intellectual, ideological movement, not a racial one. and that has to be criticized. I mean, there's more to say about this because this brings up issues that go into things like Islamophobia and the way racism has been perverted on campus to mean things it doesn't actually mean, which you can ask more about, but that's just the beginning. I should put a plug in, so probably sometime next year I have a new book coming out that addresses that question, which is how should one evaluate America's approach to Israel and the Palestinians and the whole climate on campus, which is, it's taken as obvious that we've been harming the Palestinians and should be helping them, and in fact, and it's wrong to be on Israel's side. And the book challenges that whole context and presents a view that takes Ayn Rand's ethics as the framework, which I'll encourage you guys to read when it comes out.
Thank you.
Hi. I want to know, you talked about the importance of free will to understand jihadists, but I want to know regarding public policies, I don't think that free will can be a useful variable to understand that. So, and probably there's not a casual relationship, but certainly there's a correlation between Islamics and terrorism. Not most Islamics are terrorists, but most terrorists are Islamic. So regarding public policy, how should we act within this issue?
I challenge the premise of the question. So I think it is essential to have an understanding of free will to get to the point of having practical political solutions. And just to give a few examples, so I talked about the perspective that Clinton and Trump have of this problem. Now, Clinton went on to talk about what we need to do about mental health issues as a solution to the jihadist problem. I mean, there's a whole contingent of people on kind of surrogates for her who think that that is the path to solving this problem. Because if it really is something that happens to you, it's like a virus that affects your brain, their view is we've got to invest as much in sort of mental health. Now, it's a good thing to solve mental health problems, but that's not the way to deal with the jihadist problem. And to give a different example, which I think speaks to the specific way in which a wrong view of free will leads to irrational policy. So you probably know about George W. Bush's democracy crusade in the last 10 years. We go to the Middle East, we give them elections, and that will solve the problem of the jihadists. I mean, that's a summary of his view. And a cardinal premise is what I think Yaron mentioned last night, which is Bush literally said, there's a quote, and I might paraphrase it, but it's, in the heart of everyone is a God-given love of freedom. And there's a whole contingent of people who believe that, intellectuals who frame policy. And that idea that a love of freedom is innate, like that we should all be politically on the side of freedom, that's just a given. That is a deciding premise in leading America into Iraq, staying there still, trying to create nation build there. Now, to me, it's clearly a destructive policy. And you can't explain why it's destructive unless you get that, well, no, people choose. And in fact, as soon as the Iraqis were liberated, the first priority was not to go to the voting booths, although many did. The first priority was to slit the throat of the people they hate and to go after the other sects that they regard as heretics, and then to create their own little fiefdoms and kind of dominate other people. And then what you get after several years is the Islamic State, which is one of the insurgent groups that survived and became really powerful. To me, so I challenge the question, and I think there's many steps you go through from understanding the phenomenon to formulating a policy to deal with it. I grant you that, and I'm not presenting what I think is a solution. And there is a solution. I talk about it in my book, Winning the Unwinnable War. And to give you just a flavor of what that looks like, I want to recognize that a lot of people waiting. So the issue is, if you know that it's free will, that the commitment to being a jihadist is chosen, a cardinal outcome that you want out of a policy is to take the choice away from people and tell them, no, if you choose this definitely will lead to your destruction and failure. This goal is not achievable. And you can do that. There's precedents in history, and there's a whole way to spin that into concrete policy. So,
Read Winning the Unwinnable War.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, my question is for Onkar. Most modern opposition to free will seems to stem from scientific laws, physics, cause and effect. And I want to know, does objectivism regard consciousness and free will as a physical phenomena? And if so, how does it escape the problem of cause and effect that's posed by these opponents? Or if it's a non-physical phenomena, how is that not a form of mysticism or like the ghost in the machine? How do you answer that?
So on the traditional conception of physical, it doesn't think consciousness is physical, but that is, it's not, you might think when you're using the term physical, you know what you're talking about, but you should check that premise. Do you actually know? Because what if the traditional conception is in contrast to the mental? So it's physical, not mental. It's the out there, not the things going on. You can't then turn around and say everything's physical. You've made a distinction between two kinds of things. You can't now just say, well, everything's this one. The meaning of saying everything is physical it's incoherent to do that. So in that sense, if physical means the external things that you observe and what they're made out of, and there's the observing of those things, and that's the mental, and we're distinguishing the two, then it thinks, no, there is mental things. I mean, that's how we get the distinction. And it's not supernatural. It's an aspect of the natural. And it's a relatively modern, I mean, it goes back centuries, to view it as, no, if it's not physical, it's supernatural. And the Greeks didn't have this kind of view. If you read Aristotle, for instance, it's a much more naturalistic view of the mind, though it's not the external things. It's the observation and the awareness of the external things. But they're both part of reality, which means they're both part of nature. And that's objectivism's perspective on it. But that's, again, on that understanding of physical. But it's not an easy term to unpack of what is actually meant. And people throw it around as though they know what they're talking about when it's not clear that they actually know what they're talking about.
There's also the confusion about what cause and effect is, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so the question was, do we put it on the side of the supernatural, and then do we think it's subject to cause and effect? Is that
right? And they say that because of the laws of cause and effect in physics and whatnot, that you can predict what people will choose, like what their free will do.
Yeah, I think it's a too narrow, that plays on a too narrow understanding of what cause and effect means. In what I talked about, it's some aspects and types of cause and effect, and you get the clockwork. I mean, that's true of some kinds of things, but as we're trying to point out, even in science now, they think just when they think they're not dealing with anything spooky, supernatural, no, we don't think this holds for everything. And that's a broader view of cause and effect. And I think that's the right perspective, and that's the perspective you get in objectivism. It's a very broad abstraction that there's causes and effects. And you have to think how that works for the different phenomenon you encounter. Just as when they encounter the subatomic, they think, oh, well, we have to think in different. I think you have to think of the mental in different, and the whole phenomenon of consciousness and causality in regard, in a different way than you think about billiard balls, for instance. But it doesn't make it not natural. It doesn't put it in some another realm. No, it's all part of this world. But that you can ask that tomorrow, I think, as well, on the panel that's dealing with science and psychology and free will. You ask that, I'm sure they'll have further perspective on that.
Okay, thank you.
My question's for Mr. Journo. This morning, you discredited both the left-wing and right-wing view of what makes a jihadist, so their model of what leads someone to that action, that path. So taking both that into account, that those are now discredited, how do we move forward, and how do we better predict, or even, for lack of a better word, profile someone who's going to take that path?
Okay, there's definitely things you can look at about what would make someone more likely to go down that path versus not. My understanding is that isn't a very developed field, because it overlaps psychology, philosophy, and political views. And I don't think it's just understood exactly what it looks like for someone to go down that path. And I've given it some thought. I don't have a fully developed view. But I think it's important to get that it's a religiously based worldview. And that a significant indicator of whether someone is going to go down that path is, do they show signs of becoming more pious and more committed and more vocal about their beliefs? And what's startling is that, so Omar Mateen and even the guys in Boston and others, they've been interviewed by the FBI, and the FBI kind of says, okay, well, we've interviewed you, but there's nothing here, there's nothing to go on here, and they let them go. Now, to me, that's interesting, because what is it that they're doing with the FBI when they're interviewing these people? Because to me, the first question is, so how seriously do you take your faith? And what do you think that looks like? What is an ideal society for you? Now, there's a question of whether they would tell you the truth and so on, but those are the cardinal questions that would suggest, okay, this person is unhappy with the West because it's not sufficiently pious, not sufficiently Muslim and committed to it. Well, maybe he's going to take some action that he thinks will rectify that, which is the whole premise of this movement. But I think that's missing, and then that would be a starting point for what it looks like to assess which people, what steps they might take. But I want to just caution that I think a part of what leads people into this path are certainly psychological issues and psychological dimensions. I don't think they're explanatory fully, but they're relevant. And it's not an accident that a lot of them are losers, essentially. And I think that's often an indicator. It's not always, but it's relevant, because if there's certain things that this ideology it appeals to certain kinds of people. So I think that's relevant. So I mention that because I think philosophy is cardinal, and it sets the framework, and you need that, but it doesn't answer every question for you. It just sets the context and gives you a lot of leads. And then you need other knowledge. You need knowledge about psychology and politics and sociology to bring answers to the table.
My question is on freedom of speech. The Supreme Court of the United States has decided that obscenity is not an area that is protected under the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. And my question is, do you think there is any place for the censorship of obscenity, even extremely obscene material like pornography that involves violence or children? And I think Ayn Rand said it's not very inspiring to protect some of these more grotesque things, but you have to do that because rights are always chipped away at the most despicable parts or practicers of those rights. So is there any place for decency or obscenity laws to protect people from these things, or should that all be covered under freedom of speech?
Short answer, no, there's no place for that in my view, but there's a caveat to that. I don't think the government should censor obscenity at all. Now, the only caveat, and it's not really a caveat, I think, to how we think about free speech, so child pornography is a different kind of thing entirely. It involves it involves minors who don't make choices for themselves, but it involves more than just the depiction of minors. It's a whole industry that involves the exploitation of minors, and I think you can criminalize that conduct, and I think you can criminalize the products of that conduct. But I don't see that really as fundamentally a free speech issue any more than I would look at sort of trafficking in slaves or child slaves or just slavery in general as a speech issue. If you published accounts of that, or you published promotional materials of tracking in slaves, let's say, that you would criminalize the conduct, the underlying conduct, and then anything that is incidental to that conduct can also be properly criminalized. But so what you're doing there is you're not criminalizing ideas, you're criminalizing a particular course of conduct that's criminal and that violates the rights of others. So that's the key issue that you have to focus on any time you're evaluating any kind of a criminal issue, but especially a free speech issue, because there are ways in which people can use speech that furthers a crime. So threats, incitement, fraud. What you're criminalizing in all of those cases is not the speech per se. It's the way I tend to think about it is it's the course of conduct that leads to the rights violation or is directed toward violating somebody's rights. So when you criminalize fraud, you're not criminalizing lying. You're criminalizing a specific type of lying that's intentionally designed to steal something from someone else. So criminalizing child pornography would be, in effect, criminalizing the industry of child pornography and then the fruits of that industry. But that's not really, strictly speaking, a free speech issue. So I don't think, speech as speech I can't think of an example of criminalizing speech purely for its communicative impact. What you're doing ultimately is taking a look at whether people are engaged in some sort of a criminal conspiracy or a criminal plan or some sort of a set of activities that violates the rights of others. I mean, it's a big topic, so there's a lot of other examples, but I mean, at least I think that gets to your question about obscenity.
Try to make your questions really short, and we'll try to get through all of these questions, but that requires you guys to be short as well as us. Yep.
Alrighty, so this is a two-part question, but it isn't too long, so. They're kind of related. So would citizens who are against Snowden's whistleblowing be less likely to believe in free will, and why? And then the second part, I said in the recent film, Snowden, Edward names Ayn Rand as a major influence, but the story the movie tells is Orwellian. How are Rand and Orwell's ideas of a dystopia related, and how are they different?
Yeah, I mean, the movie was made by Oliver Stone, so...
right.
Yeah, is the opposition an instance of free will? Is there people who oppose Snowden? I mean, I'm sure it's somewhere, but I don't think it's essential.
I mean, people oppose it for different kinds of reasons, and you have to assess those reasons, and there's not one category of people opposed to Snowden.
And I don't think evaluating Snowden per se is that easy, that you really have to think about what he did, why he did it, what were the impacts, what was the government doing, do we really know what the government was doing fully? I mean, I think it's a positive what he did, but I don't think it's self-evident. I think it really needs, so I can see why people would oppose it for a variety of different reasons. And what is the relation between Orwell and Rand?
So one way it's commonly put, which I actually don't think is true, or there's a grain of truth in it, is that, so if you read, for instance, Anthem, which is a dystopian novel, the portrayal of the society, of a totalitarian collectivist society, is very primitive. They retrogress from basically the 20th century to the candle's a big discovery. And that Orwell, if you take 1984, the depiction is of a much more technologically advanced, sophisticated. I don't actually think if you read 1984, and if you think of it, Anthem is many, many years after the fall of civilization or of a free society. And I don't think 1984, that's the portrayal. And it's not like you're on Star Trek or something like that. There's a lot of decay. So I don't think that is the fundamental, but there's something there. And I think what is there is that Orwell grants a power to evil that Ayn Rand does not think it has. So Ayn Rand thinks that the power that evil gains is from the default of good people. And this is part of the whole theme of Atlas Shrugged, that if the people, and so she calls this you're sanctioning evil. And it's often they do it, they don't want to do it, but they're doing it erroneously. But that is what props up dictatorships. And that's something like Soviet Russia. If it didn't get so much aid, if it didn't get so much, and early on, particularly, respect from the West, it got all kinds of material transfers of wealth. If it didn't get, it would have collapsed many, many years before the fall of the wall in the late 80s, 90s. So it was propped up by the good. And in Orwell, there's much more a sense that the evil's powerful, independent of contributions from the good. And I think that is a fundamentally different outlook on the nature of evil, including totalitarianism.
And that's why evil wins in Orwell and evil never wins in Ayn Rand.
All right, thank you.
So, in constitutional law, in the majority of countries with civil legal system, the majority of the legal doctrine, they defend the theory of proportionality, which is when two fundamental rights, they are in conflict in a concrete case, you need to analyze both of them and see which one of them stands out. So imagine a case of freedom of speech and human dignity when an individual, he makes a strong verbal harassment in a woman. So, do you agree that in this case, freedom of speech can be mitigated in favor of human dignity, for example?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. It's essentially, should free speech be balanced against human dignity, and can human dignity win out in that balance? Is that the gist of what you're asking?
Human dignity and another fundamental rights.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think human dignity is a real right. It's not there's no right to have dignity. I mean, dignity is I don't want to try to define dignity, but I think it's a fishy term. And it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So you can't have, I mean, dignity ultimately comes from your own self-conception and your own work on your own character. It doesn't come from other people. So the implicit idea here is that by criticizing you, other people can somehow destroy your dignity. So that's the first point. I don't think those two things are in conflict. The second point to make very briefly is rights are never in conflict if you actually understand what rights are. We have the right to take the actions necessary to sustain our lives so long as we don't violate the rights of others. We do that by initiating force against other people. So long as you don't initiate force and you leave people alone, our rights are never in conflict. So you don't need a balancing of rights. And the whole conception in constitutional law in the Western world that we balance rights is completely fundamentally wrong. It went off track pretty badly in the late 19th century, although there are ways in which the founders, I think, made mistakes too. And frankly, what Rand added to our conception of rights is hugely clarifying in this way. I mean, I think it's one of her great contributions to the philosophy of law. I think that covers all your questions, right?
Yeah, we can talk later.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, there's one more thing, but ask later on. So there is an issue of harassment, but I'm not going to try to go into that. There is such a thing as harassment that involves speech and conduct. It kind of gets back to my answer on obscenity before. So yes, it's possible to violate the law by harassing another person, and that involves speech and can involve speech. But we can have objective laws on that. That's not a balancing issue. That goes really more toward, like you can think of harassment as a kind of a threat or preventing you from carrying out the actions that you need to live your life. But that's a more complicated issue.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. The conflict between Western ideals and the jihadist movement has been described multiple times as a war of ideas. What do you think that the private sector as well as the government can do to sort of wage this war of ideas and end up victorious? Because, I mean, there's a fundamental difference between what both sides is looking for. How do we persuade people who might be on the fence one way or the other?
So I will say briefly, read the book that was mentioned earlier, Winning the Unwinnable War, and also the one, Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism. Both of them deal with that issue. The short answer is there's a lot to be done in the so-called war of ideas, but it's not just a war of ideas. It should also be a real war, and we haven't had that. And I think they go together, because if you have a real war, essential to that is to declare openly and with real moral confidence what it is you're fighting for and why the people you're fighting against are in the wrong. And we didn't do that. So to me, that goes, and if you do that, you're also putting your enemy on notice and telling them that you don't give them any sanction, you don't credit them with anything, and which is exactly the opposite of what we did. So I think there's a lot to be done. Where we are now, 15 years after 9/11 and so far into these unending wars, it's an even harder task. And I think the key thing I would recommend is to get people to see both that we are in the right, because people now don't get that and don't even understand what that means, and what it looks like to defeat the enemy. And both of those things are part of the war of ideas, of educating people and getting them to see what's true.
So let me just say, I mean, it's wrong to conceptualize this as a war of ideas in this sense. This is a war. People are dying. People are killing us. First and foremost, this is a war. Tanks, bombs, soldiers kind of war. The war of ideas, it's not like if we promote our ideas, we're going to convince the Muslim world and they're going to change their mind. The war of ideas is actually here in the West. It's in America to try to convince people to engage in the real war that needs to be won. But you need the one doesn't replace the other. It's not like, oh, this is an intellectual. No, in that sense, war is not a good word when applied to ideas, because war is really, it's war. It's war. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm a huge proponent of free will because I think it enforces personal responsibility. But something I do struggle with understanding is what extent can free will exist in situations where someone with a mental illness is not exhibiting lucid moments?
So I don't know. It's important, the context for philosophy, when you're talking about free will, you're assuming a normal person with health, including a functioning brain, and there's all kinds of there can be psychological issues and neurophysiological, there's a question of like what kind of control is even possible to this person, and the legal system has to deal with these kinds of cases as well. But I have no expertise in that. Again, the panel tomorrow will have some people who have more expertise on thinking about that kind of issue. Philosophy doesn't focus on all the ways in which people can be incapacitated, disease. Those are specialized sciences, and you need that knowledge, and the legal system has to try to make use of that knowledge, for instance, in assessing legal responsibility for actions.
Okay, quick, guys.
Okay, I was actually going to ask a similar question, but I'll pivot. Immanuel Kant had a response to your, well, not a sufficient one in my mind, but a response to the idea that there's a mental and a physical dichotomy. And he says that just because a cause can be mentally attributed, that doesn't mean cannot be broken down into whether it's electrochemical signals, like someone with a psychological disorder, an anxiety disorder, their neurons are firing and the amygdala is always active. Like psychology is very experimental and theoretical at this point, but I was wondering, does someone, I guess I'll pivot back, but does someone with an anxiety disorder or someone who, their mother smoked and drank coffee when they were pregnant, or someone who's totally insane, do they have the capacity to develop free will? Is it handicapped? Can they sort of will their way can they change that chemical imbalance with their consciousness? Can they say, no, I will not.
So I'm going to cut you short just because we're running out of time.
Yeah, and a similar answer. Ask those questions tomorrow, I think. But it's not a dichotomy between the physical and the mental. I mean, that's the view. It's the opposite. It's that they are integral to understanding a human being, but they're two aspects of it, and you're distinguishing the physical from the mental. You're distinguishing two aspects of a person, and both are real. So it's not a dichotomy.
If your question is longer than a sentence, I'm going to cut it off.
All right. Considering that I have limited time and energy to devote to learning topics, where's the practical point where I should stop trying to learn something, and to what extent should I disengage with a topic that I don't know about or don't have time to research?
It depends on how important that topic is to your values and your life. So if you want to be a physicist, devote a lot of energy and a lot of time and effort to the study of physics. To the extent that morality is important to everything in life, it's important that you know the basic ideas in morality. So it depends on your values and your life and.
So it's a different orientation. The question's I find a little weird. It's like I'm learning about something and I don't really care about, like, when should I stop? It's rather focus on the things you need to be learning and then think of, but you can get too specialized and too just immersed in one subject and you know a lot about very, very little. And you need a wider perspective, but I need that and I need to gain it, not like, why should I stop? It's why am I after the knowledge that I'm after, I think should be driving me.
Okay, thank you.
It shouldn't be a duty premise. It should be a value-driven premise.
My question is for Onkar. So how do you defend against those who will deny that the introspection of the self leads to the conclusion of free will existing?
If it really is that I think they've thought about it and they're trying to introspect, and they say, no, it's nothing, there's nothing you can do any more than if someone says, if you take the bottle here and they keep insisting, no, I don't see a bottle. I can't reason or argue them into that. Now, it might be, you might think, well, no, there's reasons why they're having trouble conceptualizing what they're introspecting and putting it into work. That's a different thing. But if I really think I'm at the stage where they're just saying they don't see the bottle, there's nothing I can do.
Thank you.
Okay, quick.
The last question. I was wondering about the situation in Iraq, and you were saying that you can always choose free will, right, instead of the religion that you've been almost imposed from the very beginning of your life. But in so many cases, I'm thinking of Saddam Hussein, whose reign and his like tyrannic regime, like, the closer, the more power he got. In the end, he felt that he was like, sent from above. So what I'm saying is that sometimes religion is too inextricably part of your mind that it alters the psycho. And this man killed so many people, and there was no other way for him to choose.
I mean, we've said this, and I think you're right. I think, particularly under authoritarianism, the people shut down their minds. I mean, We the Living talks about this, and some of the characters in We the Living shut down their thinking, shut down their free will in a sense, and they go to drift because it's too painful to exercise your free will. So if you have a regime like Saddam Hussein and other regimes, the people are often they can't exercise their free will, so they just don't. They just drift. Religion can take over your mind, particularly if it's drilled into you when you're young so much that it limits your choices. It really does incapacitate you. But it's still choices that people are making. In this case, it's the people who are brainwashing you, who are really forcing these ideas down your throat, or the people who are limiting your freedom, like Saddam Hussein did.
But what will we do now with Mosul, where they're now trying to liberate the city with the help of American forces? And
I would say read Winning the Unwinnable War, because there's no simple... people ask me, what do you do about Syria? And the answer is, there's no answer to that question. The question is, you have to look at the Middle East, and you have to say, what is a threat? How do you deal with that threat? And what is your interest in dealing with that threat? So just what do you do with Mosul? Or what do you do with Syria? What do you do with this? It is an out-of-context question. You have to question, what are your interests? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? What is the threat? And how do you deal with that threat? For example, there's nothing to do with Syria unless you do with Saudi Arabia and Iran. There's no point in talking about who cares, right? So it's the same with Mosul. What do you do about Mosul?
I'm just saying that they just
everybody's
got
a bad guy
from people there who say that, well, probably we're better with ISIS.
Yeah, some people. Because both parties are really evil. So
we're trying so forcefully to liberate the city with the people who do not. America.
I'm not. We're not advocating for liberating Mosul in the way it's being done and by the people it's being done.
So this is something maybe we can follow up later, but I think part of your question is trying to get at, in a society that's being trodden down, the way Saddam Hussein oppressed people, in a society like people living under ISIS control, what happens to those people? What does it look like to go from that to an actual human society where people can thrive and flourish? And that's a huge transformation, and there's questions about how achievable that is and what that takes. If that's part of your question, there's things to say about it, and it goes to the issue of free will, and more fundamentally, one has to see that there's no solution except for people in the region making choices themselves. Like nothing the outside forces can do. But if you're interested in that aspect or other things, just definitely follow up.
Thank you, guys.